PATIO conversation number 8. It's the first on the research theme, landscape ecology and environment. This theme addresses issues of ecological significance, which are of increasing importance in contemporary practice at a point at which our actions increasingly exert a significant impact on the Earth's ecosystems. Exploring relationships between development and ecology in the 19th and 20th centuries provides a means of addressing this shift and of potentially identifying and framing precedents for contemporary ethical practice. Papers in this theme may consider changes to landscapes and ecologies, relationships between infrastructural developments and environments, or at an architectural scale, analyze passive climatic strategies, including those associated with tropical modernism. So in this first session, we'll be joined by Labib Hossain and Javairia Shahid as speakers and Deepa Ramaswamy as respondent. So we're going to begin with Labib. Labib Hossain is an assistant professor of architecture at Delhi University. He received his PhD in architecture from Cornell University. His talk is titled The Making of Dry Ramna, the New Civil Station of Dacca, 1880 to 1911. And it will explore the discourse of contained waters in the making of dry and modern Dacca, and how it emerged through a series of colonial practices, interventions, and interventions. So I'll pass over to Labib.
Thanks, Catherine, for the intro. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, yes, it's good.
All right, perfect. So again, thanks, Catherine. I mean, good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. So I'm Labib Hossain, currently a faculty at Miami University. And first of all, I'd like to say thanks to PATIO Network, the organizers. Thanks for inviting me here, and good to see you all. So today I will talk about the making of Dry Ramna, the new civil station of Dacca. So I will start with an anecdote. On December 14, 1905, when Dhaka just became the provincial capital after the Bengal partition, a secretary to the government wrote that the lieutenant governor declined further funding for the waterworks extension, in a quote, until the town is thoroughly drained. So a dry Dhaka, as it seems, was essential to the design of its water infrastructure. So in this presentation, I will focus on a portion, a chapter of my recently completed dissertation, which traces the historical production of a relationship between contained waters and the creation of dry lands through both ideas and design interventions in the landscape that were central to the colonial enterprise. So how a dry Dhaka was produced materially and discursively. So these are the images from the last chapter of my dissertation, and scholars have discussed the Indo-Saracenic buildings in terms of style, technology applied, etc. But here I will discuss this building through a different lens, which is the history of dryness. And by the history of dryness, I mean how the concept or environment of dryness was construed over time and how it was invented materially and discursively. So tracing a particular transformation as different techniques were applied to the ground, and that kind of facilitated subsequent architectural and landscape interventions in such a way as to establish a specific understanding of modernity premised upon what I call a discourse of drying. So in my dissertation, I actually explore 4 colonial techniques dedicated to the abstraction and eventual erasure or containment of water: walling, piping, draining, and building. And by technique, I mean not just a use of tools or machinery, but the elaborate networks of experts, machines, methods, ideas, and systematic exchanges between them used to attain certain political, environmental, and economic goals. So in this presentation, I will focus on the third and fourth technique. So just to giving you a context, the location of Dhaka, which is located in the eastern Bengal, which is an active delta. And I quickly want to address two important works on Bengal in the field of environmental history. The environmental historians who actually focused on Bengal mainly limited their discussion to West Bengal, as Iqbal mentioned in his book. So Iqbal's work was an attempt to fill the gap, but nonetheless, the few works on East Bengal mainly center on agrarian contexts. Whereas Bhattacharya's work, which focuses on Kolkata, which incorporates recent theoretical insights, but her research also did not quite consider the surrounding commodity frontiers in a much broader regional scale. So my work is located in between methodologically and geographically. And the two other works I want to mention, like from very different fields, seemingly on very different topics. Jyoti Hosagra's work is on about architectural style, modernity, and Sunil Amrit's work is about monsoon climate and water. But my work shows that they are related, and the discourse on style in deltaic Bengal cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the ruling of the waters. So as the waterworks started supplying piped water in Dhaka, it created the need for an efficient drainage system. People started using more piped water and generating more waste. Any stagnant water or waterlogging was perceived as a threat, kind of disturbing water forms, percolating into the piped water and polluting the overall water supply system. So sanitary reports from the decade of 1880s reveal an elaborate campaign by municipal officials to fill up the inland water bodies. The network of water bodies, which had historically performed the drainage of West, particularly during the monsoon time, was almost entirely filled up, and the piled up West became a major threat to the newly constructed drains. Thus, a conservation system was introduced which involved the collection of waste from the households and then dumping them at the trenching grounds located at the periphery of the town. So trenching grounds, which initially started with acquiring lands, and because of rendering that as a public purpose, which helped them to acquire the lands, and then dumping the waste in lines prescribed by the sanitary engineer. Uh, so in general, the trenching operation under the conservancy scheme would play a vital role in flattening and transforming the landscape to high-level dry lands suitable for future expansion of a modern city. And Ramna actually was the first trenching ground site in Dhaka, which was cleared for trenching. And interestingly, after the Bengal partition, this area became the site for the new civil station, the main government headquarters of the new capital. So within almost 4 decades after the formation of Dhaka municipality, and as these techniques reconfigured and dried up the Dhaka landscape, the dry and high ground was prepared for the construction of buildings. So urban development received a massive boost after the Bengal partition of 1905, when Dhaka became the provincial capital of the Eastern Province. As a precursor of India-Pakistan partition, 1947 partition, this 1905 partition was an experimental religious divide that actually accelerated communal violence and nationalist movements on both sides. However, for Dhaka, the new capital status resulted in an elaborate campaign of construction to accommodate new administrative buildings and ceremonial landscape in the Ramna area. So before talking about the buildings, I'd like to highlight a court case between the Shibite of the Ramna Kali temple and the revenue department over the issue of land ownership, which is a prototypical case that highlights how land acquisition occurred during the phase of building the capital, as well as discursive transformation from mounds to a building site. So this is a painting of the Ramna area in 1833 by an official named Joseph Scott Phillips. Um, uh, and this painting is showing the Ramnakali temple, but on its river side, Phillips described the scene. In a quote, establishment of Hindu fakirs. In a cold evening after rain, these fellows worship their idols at least 3 times a day with a huge sounding of tom-toms and shrieking of conches. End of quote. So the ritual practice and the sensory ambience of the place, Philip records here, supplement his visual representation of the physical condition of the landscape of this portion of the town. Besides the dominating appearance of the temple structure, another striking feature is the mound on which the temple and huts are positioned. So this is a typical mound which can be found throughout the Lower Bengal region and which is a result of the dig and mound practice. However, the government started acquiring the lands in Ramna initially for the trenching grounds starting around 1880s and 1890s. So the case of Ramnakali temple was symptomatic, with most of its land eventually being formally acquired by the government through its mobilization of the discourses of urban governance, visual aesthetics, and public sanitation. So for example, in one instance, the collector of Dhaka argued that if the Hindu public was okay with turning the land into a vegetable garden, then why would they object if the land were kept open? So clearly the open or elevated land in the official's definition was devoid of ditches, vegetation, and tanks that had to some extent served the Hindu ritualistic practices. So in the course of less than 100 years, the mound of Ramna, which Phillips had sketched in 1833, would be entirely converted into an elevated clear open field, ready for the construction of the government buildings of the new capital. So by 1905, all the lower elevations in Ramna, which had been categorized either as ditches or wastelands, were being claimed as government property thanks to the trenching system, which reconfigured these lands not just as clear open fields, but also as property owned by the government after its application for the public purpose of transforming waste into productive land. So Jyoti Hosagrhar used the term indigenous modernity to highlight the politics of cultural transformation in the incomplete landscapes and the paradoxical form it involved. So I'd like to mention 3 specific projects: the Government House, the Secretariat, and the Curzon Hall. Architectural historians discussed the emergent Indo-Saracenic style, which is the combination of Gothic or neoclassical and Mughal styles, which sought to pacify the growing anti-colonial agitation by promising a kind of sense of a false ownership. So but historical and religious style were not the only means of architectural consensus and pacification. It was also about cultivating the desire of being modern, where the dry and high grounds, free of germs, corpse, dampness, and any uncertainties, had been acquiring such consensus through the discursive transformation. So for example, in that chapter, I discussed how the site was prepared, dried, and elevated. So in general, the colonial administration could successfully mobilize the hygiene and drying discourse, because of which both the local elites and colonial officials worked together in filling up most of the water bodies and clearing the forest. In case of Ramna, the presence of religious structures and forests disrupted the completeness of the imagined and idealized site conditions. The administration could not demolish some of these structures under the protests by the local. Even though these religious structures were strange and disturbing elements, however, social unrest would be the last thing they would want in the changed political context, as they needed the support of the locals, particularly the Muslims, in dealing with the rising anti-colonial movements, which was mainly led by Hindus in Kolkata. As a result, they had to retain the presence of these structures in an uneasy coexistence with the new government buildings. Perhaps these pre-existing conditions guided the adoption of the Saracenic style, as the government did not want the new buildings to appear as contrasting with the ones that enjoyed so much veneration on the part of the locals. So I argue that the Indo-Saracenic style was tactically employed here in a way that strengthened the colonial government's hegemony over the remnant landscapes of indigenous modernity that they could not fully transform. So I published about the post-history of this period, the modern idea of contained water that was materially and discursively produced through the colonial drawing discourse gave rise a lineage that is visibly present in subsequent architectural discourses and practices, from Patrick Geddes' town planning report for Dhaka to Louis Kahn's assembly building complex, completed after Bangladesh's independence in 1971. So in conclusion, by addressing the history of landscape, environment, and their interaction on the one hand, and that of engineering and infrastructure, considering both as integral component of architectural history, this study attempted to explain the various intangible threads that connect the buildings to the socio-political context and the particularities of the site, which have been largely overlooked in studying the colonial architecture in Deltaic Bengal. Yeah, that's it from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Labib. It was a fantastic presentation. I think there's like several points there that are relevant, particularly relevant to sort of contemporary practice, particularly the way India is transforming at the moment. Before I go ahead, I should have mentioned at the beginning that I'm the director of the theme on landscape ecology and environment, and Deepa Ramaswamy is the coordinator of the theme. Deepa will be giving the response, but the day today has been organized by the two of us. So now I'd like to invite Javairia to speak. Javairia Shahid is a PhD candidate in Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Her talk is titled Thinking Like a River, Water, Land and Labor in Colonial Punjab, 1849 to 1920. And it will examine how during the pivotal decades spanning India's subjugation to the British Crown in 1857 and its eventual partition in 1947, the arid wastelands of Punjab underwent a profound transformation under the sway of colonial governments and economic imperatives. So Javairia, I'd like to ask you to share your screen and invite you to speak. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Catherine. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, okay. I see some. Thanks. All right, here we go. I tend to do this a lot. I changed the title a little bit. So today I'll be talking about, well, more or less the same thing, irrigation infrastructure, labor, and the territorial imagination in colonial Punjab. All right, so Catherine did a really great job of summarizing the overall project, so I won't get into that too much. But I will start by saying that this profound transformation, which was environmental and social and economic at the same time, was hinged on the idea of this region, Western Punjab, being an arid desert. And the desert in the British imagination was a wasteland in need of improvement. However, as we know, this is rarely the case. Deserts are anything but empty. And one should always be skeptical of white regions on a map, as this area was represented before the Canal Colonies project. So these lands in Punjab were converted into fertile fields dedicated to the cultivation of lucrative cash crops, which included sugarcane, wheat, and cotton, and the mobilization of labor. Large-scale perennial canal irrigation made this transformation possible. And between 1860 and 1930, more than 15 million acres were brought under the command of the irrigation machine. And here you can see, some of the before and after representations of the region. This is one of the mandi towns. So these are photographs from this sort of guide on the youngest canal colony, the Chenab colony, which is the focus of this study. we generally know where we are, but just to make sure that we're, everybody knows where I'm talking about, but everybody knows this one. But so if you can you see my cursor? Sort of, yeah. Okay, perfect. So this is Punjab. And as many of you already know, empire sort of started here and then moved down this way. And then eventually the British made their way up here to Punjab. So this is sort of the last phase of colonization in this region. Punjab was colonized in 1849. And so this is to highlight the fact that by the time they've gotten here, they've had a number of political and economic, but also just infrastructural and architectural experiments all over the country. And they're sort of taking all of those lessons and applying them in Punjab. So now I'm going to zoom in on this region right here, right? So this is Punjab. Here, this is, it sort of just tells us a different, points out the different regions. We're going to be looking at this region here. And I'm going to show you the rivers just now. Okay, so Punjab, the land of 5 rivers. These are the 5 rivers. As you can see, this is the Indus right here. Then the Jhelum. This is the Chenab. This is the one where I'm going to be talking about a lot. So this is the Chenab. This is the Ravi. And then right here is the Bias and the Satluj. The current India-Pakistan border is sort of like here, somewhere over here. So this, massive water system is bifurcated. And even at the time of the British, so the Ganga water project is separate, it comes before. But the one on in Punjab on especially the Chenab and the Indus where they intersect right here was a whole different beast in terms of scale and economic input. All right, so this is where the rivers are. And here I just want to that is way. So this is the administrative divisions. I'm going to be, like I said, talking a lot about Lailpur, the capital of the Chenab colony. And if I can point out here, so what I want to show here is how the lines of communication, railway and roads, etc., how not only do they become intertwined with the waterways, but between these two, the water infrastructure sort of comes first. The railway infrastructure sort of follows, but that's not the case everywhere. So they have a sort of symbiotic relationship, but are planned and constructed with completely different imperatives. The irrigation department is divided between the revenue. There's a revenue branch and an engineering branch. So they're concerned about how to make this work mechanically, but also make it economically viable. And the imperatives with the railway system are somewhat related, but also different. Then it's movement of troops, and the telegraph lines are laid out next to the railways, etc. Okay. This is a Chenab colony. This is the British obsession with clock towers, of course, found its way to Punjab as well. And so this is a center of Lailpur. The clock tower is at the center of 8 bazaars, and the city sort of spreads out from here. All right, and this is just to show you the scale of this massive, massive project. So here you can see the main canals, and along it, all of the smaller canals that were constructed. And the highlighted areas that you see around them is where the settlements or the colonies were formed. And, other grants were given for different kinds, like horse farms, so on and so forth. But this is just to give you a sense of the scale and how these come together. So this is, if you remember, this is the Indus, and then this is the Chenab right here. And this is the region that we're talking about. This is from the this image was presented, well, a map was presenting it at the 1903 Shimla conference, which is, 1903, they got together and said, well, we're having all of these problems. Let's put together a committee and figure things out. There's a lot of problems. By this time, they've realized that there's a lot of problems with drainage and waterlogging, which, as Labib also pointed out, has a set of then other problems that arise due to different diseases, etc. So this is from that era. All right. So so between 1892 and 1930, the colony, the Chenab colony, expanded to around 2 million acres, with Dairpur serving as a main market mandi, serving the regional centers as far as Amritsar, Ludhiana, Jalandhar. Dairpur, so like right here somewhere, was also the main central node for all of Punjab, where all goods, etc., gathered, especially wheat, and were then sent south to Karachi, the seaport from where it was then exported elsewhere. All right. As you know, there was plenty of water in India. Water wasn't the problem. British engineers and planners, discerning Punjab's hydrological challenge, not as one of water scarcity, but of uncertainty, that is, the erratic abundance of water at the wrong time, embarked upon a monumental endeavor to tame the river Indus and its tributaries. Their ambition was succinctly articulated by the governor of Punjab from 1928 to 1933, who envisioned nothing less than making the desert bloom. And then designed around this irrigation system, alluvial planning and colonial settlements attempted to rein in Punjab's tumultuous environment by orchestrating land utilization in harmony with the rhythms of irrigation and water management. And this was not easy in a place like Punjab in northern India, because with every rainy season, rivers moved, and the rainfall, the amount of water you would get, was bound to the temperamental nature of the monsoon. And the soil was also so varied in this entire region because of, just geologically how this region has been formed, that the soil either soaked up too much moisture or too little. So there's all of these problems that they're constantly trying to figure out. All right. Where are we? There we go. The result, and here I'm showing you a regulator at Mangla, and another one on the lower Bari Doab. So these monumental land features that were built by the British is at a scale that was, never before thought of. And this project was not only the largest infrastructure project, but also one of the largest social engineering projects, one that encompassed everything from the scale of the microbes in the soil to the varieties of cash crops that were planted, to that of social units themselves, and one may even argue nations. How are we on time? Catherine, can I bother you to tell me how much more time I have? Because I tend to go
about
over.
4 minutes left, and you can run a
Okay.
couple of minutes with that if you
All
like.
right, okay, so then I will skip this, but if we have time, I will come back to this. This is some, rare videos that I found, which are just really strange, but show what Punjab looked like at this time. We'll come back to that. But what I want to talk about is one of the freedom movements around this time. So, like I said, this is the engineering of everything from the scale of the soil to social units. And all of these scales at which this project operated met with resistance, including the Kisan uprising of 1907. And if we get time, I'll talk about it, the Khatar movement in later years. At the farmers, the Kisan agitation, uprising, gathering in Layalpur's Chenab colony in 1907, Banke Dayal sang. I will read it out in Punjabi and then just quickly translate. Pagdi sambhal o jata, lut liya tera mal, hal bihal hoye, o fasla nu kha gaye keede, tan te nahi tere lire, ਭੁੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਖੂਬ ਨਿਚੋੜੇ, ਰੋਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਬਾਲ ਉਹ ਪਗੜੀ. So, this is in 1907 after massive crop failure in famine conditions. And so Banke Dayal is calling out to the Jat farmers, and he's saying, hold on to your pagdi, which is like a, represents your honor. You were robbed, the state is robbing you. The pests have already eaten all of your crops, and your children are going hungry. What are you waiting for? It's time for war. Hail the cry of war and hold on to their pagdi. So this is, like a call to war. And I know I'm running short on time, so I would quickly skip through this. I was going to talk about the bollworm crop failure, but we will come to that maybe another time. So the movement, which was called Sambhal Lahar, called upon the Punjabi farmer to rise in solidarity and fight for the fruits of their soil, of their blood and labor, worked into the land over generations. The movement coalesced around the increase in irrigation water tax and the Punjab Land Colonization Act of 1903, which, despite famine conditions in most of the province, but nothing changed, even though there was famine condition all over the province, and there was already a lot of unrest in the region because of the Punjab Land Alienation Act, which prevented non-agricultural tribes from owning land. This especially effective what were called criminal or scheduled tribes by the British, like the Dalit and the Chamar. And I know I'm running out of time, so I will just very quickly tell you the broad overview of the dissertation and the sections. So the dissertation traces these transformations in terms of water and land and labor and time against the backdrop of these social movements that are emerging at the time. The first section on water and irrigation examines design, construction, and maintenance of the irrigation infrastructure. I chart water distribution in measurable and taxable units from the river to the watercourse in the field, using an elaborate system of canals, distributaries, and barrages that work to transform what was previously common property to commodity. And I do this through tracing what's called the duty of water. The idea that a certain amount of water should do a certain amount of work and how you tax it and so on. Another section of this chapter focuses on the engineering school, which was set up in Roorkee. And here I sift through some of the lectures on irrigation that were delivered, and the canal colony manuals, which served as didactic guides for water and land management. And here, this one's very interesting. It's been translated into Urdu for local on-the-ground surveymen. This is a canal colony, the manuals, the canal colony manuals. All right, and I think I'm out of time, right?
You're just 2 minutes over. So yeah, I think it's time to finish up, but it's a shame. If you'd like to finish, that would be
all right,
fine.
I will just give you a very quick, so then, another section then traces against these developments and thinking about, land and, water and infrastructure, how land itself is changing. And I focus on this thing called the Jamabandi document, which is, kind of like a proprietary, it proves property of land. So in Punjab, ownership and proprietary right is different. It's not the same thing. And there's a range of occupancy of land, different forms of that between these two poles. And so the Farid Bandi document, based on how water is being utilized and where these canals are, was a kind of like a reworking of how land was understood and how land worked. Then I have a chapter on labor, which we don't have time for. And I wanted to say a little bit about the Ghadar movement, but yeah, maybe we'll talk about that in the Q&A. And yeah, I will stop there. And I did say I will talk about the CFP, but I wanted to invite all of you to submit an abstract for a panel that my colleague Robin Hangore and I are hosting at not this one, the next, the 2016 SAH. So I will send this to Catherine and then she can send it to all of you, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Javairia. I wish that we'd had a little more time. It would have been great to get into some of the extra details. And also I would have loved to have seen the film on the landscapes. I think this idea of being actually to see change is very powerful, especially as we're seeing some of these processes continuing. I'm very quickly going to introduce Deepa Ramaswamy. Thank you so much, Deepa, for joining us as respondent, for acting as respondent today, as well as co-host. So Deepa is an architect, historian, and assistant professor of architecture and urbanism at the University of Houston. She's a noted scholar in the field of land and environmental histories. Deepa's research examines land and environmental histories, focusing on the regulatory systems, organizational practices, and financial instruments that shape the built environment. Her current research projects include tracing the history of reclaimed lands along Mumbai's coasts and examining the privatized public realm in post-war New York City. So I'll give it to you, Deepa. And just to let you know that once Deepa's given the response, we'll be opening for questions. You're welcome to put your hand up or to also type your questions in the chat, and we'll read those out and call on you. Thanks very much, Deepa.
Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. I have made notes based on your abstract, which is what I got. And I think some of the questions are already answered in your presentation and some need to be engaged with. Feel free to answer or not answer or not engage with the points I make. So we got to engage with two very good research projects today, Javairia and Labib. Both projects relate to the larger thematic, of course, of landscape, ecology, and environment, but the center is the thematic of water, the control of water, the reining in of water. Javairia speaks, because we ended with her first, Javairia speaks about the transformation, or what she calls the, quote, transfiguration of an inhospitable desert wasteland, and wasteland figures in both your works. The transformation of an inhospitable desert wasteland into fertile lands, right? Her take on this, and that is done through the reining in of Punjab's environment, land utilization, ownership patterns, and water, of course. But there is an interesting take here as to where this is not about water scarcity, but it is about abundance. But the abundance is erratic. So it is not useful abundance in that way. So at the center is the question of abundance and considerations of depletion. Labib, on the other hand, talks about Dacca when it was the provincial capital of the Eastern Province under British colonial administration, and landscapes of, quote, high and dry ground. High and dry means free of germs, free of corpses, free of dampness, and free of uncertainties, right? So this is an interesting take too. So he talks about the language of dryness that was concretized through the process of building as a technique of land making. And I had a question there. I think your presentation kind of clarified that, but I'm going to still bring it up because both of your papers have a question of land, have a question of property, have a question of this transformation, right? The making of something that is land and then the transformation of that land into property. So, so this is for Labib. Can you speak more or expand more on this concept of building as land making, because it's and how it relates to question of property? And Javairia, how does your notion of reigning in abundance, right, in your work, the reigning of an inn of abundance, relate to Labib's central concept of dryness, right? So in both cases, you're keeping water out, in both water out or controlling water in a way. You're reining it in, you're controlling it through land utilization and infrastructure in Javaria's case, and through building as a process of land making. So there is, I wanted to see if we could address the question of abundance that comes through reining in, and dryness that also comes through some sort of reining in of water. And the second thing I wanted to point out between both the papers is both of them upset some core assumptions. And both of you can correct me if I have read this wrong. The core assumption one with Labib is land precedes architecture. He has kind of upset that core assumption. And with Javairia, it is that abundance is almost always natural wealth, right? This theory that, if there is abundance, all our problems are solved. And the third connection, this is not an upsetting of a core assumption, is that I was writing while you both were presenting, is how wastelands, this idea that you first have to engage with this something, call it wasteland, and then transform it into property or usable land. So the question of wasteland is there undergirding both your projects. But I think the core assumptions is something we can also engage with. Land preceding architecture, and abundance is always natural wealth. And then the last point I want to make, I promise I'm going to end after this, is with Javairia, if you can relate to Ezra Klein's recent take on abundance, right? That I'm sure you already, the recent take that he has made, that today's problems are not the result of yesteryear's villains, but rather one generation solution that becomes the next generation's problems, right? In your case, Javairia, that clearly comes through. So I wanted to know if this idea that Ezra Klein brings up of abundance talks, if at all, you think it talks to Punjab's territorial transformation and how it is today, right? Coming back to the question of landscape and ecology. How did this one generation solution, the colonial solution, leave behind, affect the current landscape in the region? And Labib, for your discourse on dryness, how does it sit with questions of climate emergencies right now, right? The question of dryness, because whenever we have tried to get dry, in a forcible infrastructural way, it has never ended well, right? Wetness is in fact a solution for climate emergencies, right? So how do you see the question of dryness relate to current discourses on climate emergencies? Which is where I was really interested in dryness. So that's where I'll end. You don't have to engage with all the questions. I know I threw out a lot of things. Feel free to correct me if I misunderstood something. I'm going to stop talking now. So maybe Labib can, I was going to give a direction. Go ahead, Labib.
Sure. Thank you so much, Deepa, for your thoughtful insights and pointing out some very critical and important themes out of the presentations. Some overlaps. So you pointed out about first of all, you mentioned about the building as land making. And this is actually, of course, I kind of summarized a lot of things in the presentation, but also in my dissertation, I actually, instead of talking, delving more on the building as an object or focusing on the architectural components or the kind of explaining the terminologies, I focused more on the preparation of the site. And as I mentioned, the site was kind of elevated and prepared with the application of different techniques. First of all, the bonding the river, then implementing the waterworks, and then filling the lowlands. And but ultimately, it's in the last chapter, it's more about where water is not that visible, but also visible, right? It is, even though I mentioned the land is prepared, but when I was really reading through the reports of land acquisition, the land preparing, and the engagement of the Public Works Department, they were like really still got overwhelmed with the amount of water that needed to be kind of treated in a way. The expenditure got like threefold, fourfold, but now since it's a capital, they kind of tried to deal with it in a way. And ultimately, so basically that's the transformation I wanted to trace from that mounds, which is just like elevated land for that buildings or the settlements or the structures. Now it's like the complete elevated land, and how it complemented with the buildings that got built over there. So that's I mean, of course, I actually also talked about the different acts and that were instrumental in terms of like kind of legally terming that as a property. And these buildings got built, but at the same time, as I mentioned, some elements were still there. Some of the majars, the mausoleums, one of them is very closely located to the government house building that I showed. It's still there, and I mean, so, I mean that was the reality that they were dealing with. There were different resistances and so on. So that's one thing, like focusing our attention more on the preparation of the site and this different transformation, keeping in mind with the socio-political context. It was the period of cultural turmoil, the period I talked about. So, and I think fast forward. So in talking about the importance of, or the need of this discussion on drawing discourse and its connection with like the current topics like climate emergencies and other issues. I mean, this is the thing, the mentality that we carried forward, that how to think about building site in an urban context, in a very crowded, dense urban context like Dhaka. And it seems like the site needs to be like elevated entirely before the building proceeds. So which is why, I mean, waterlogging is a very common issue, particularly in the active delta. We have the monsoon climate, and in every rainy season there are these issues like waterlogging and so on. So definitely this solution can come from different angles, different perspectives, but first we need to acknowledge like what sort of material and discursive transformation took place, in what ways, in what political context, serving which political ideologies. So I think that is important to acknowledge, and then from where we can maybe talk about future solutions. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, but thanks for the comments.
You gave me a lot of things to think about, so I'm going to take me a little bit of time and give you a very articulate answer, but some quick thoughts about some of the points that you brought up. First, about abundance.
We can't seem to hear you clearly.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, this is better. Can you?
Okay. Sorry. I think I was just very far away from the mic. So abundance. So there's a idea of engineering and infrastructure as being the means to wield in that abundance. That's the narrative that I see again and again in these settlement reports and these irrigation reports on. So this idea of through engineering, nature can be tamed. But really, it's what I find is not so much it. Of course, nature has to be tamed through this these actual engineering projects. But at the same time, what the British are really up against is also society. It's the people who are then actually using this water in the field, for example. And in recent, some of the back and forth correspondence between some of the administrators, one of the themes that I noticed comes up again and again is how this narrative around the farmers are inefficient. They are wasteful. And so we must have all of these, techniques that we have to teach them so that water can be used, which is, is abundant, but is being wasted, can be used better. What's curious is that by any standard, the irrigation system, the irrigation machine, as they think of it, is very inefficient. Kennedy something, I forget his last name, but he's this person who does a lot of these studies for the government in Punjab. And he estimates that if 100 units of water leaves the head of the canal, only 28 units of it actually reach the farm. So the water is, it's being absorbed in the canals, it's being lost to evaporation, it's being stolen. There's all of these other problems that technology is shown to have solved, but, remain problems all the same. And the bit that I'm working on now is thinking about the water outlet as sort of the interface where these two systems sort of interact with one another. So the water outlet is it's like the tap at the end of the let's say the canal. And on one side, so then water is a property of the state, right? And then on the other side, it becomes a property of the farmer. And it's really interesting. This is where, it gets a little science and technology history-esque. The outlet, again, there's this idea of, oh, the system is so efficient because it is mathematical and we have figured it all out. But the outlet, the size of the outlet has to be determined based on a number of factors. For example, what crop is being grown there? How much water does it use? Is it being grown for the first time, which means that more water will be required to make the soil feasible for plantation, so on and so forth. So in theory, the size of the outlet can be fixed, but really it can't be. It's all trial and error. And they have to keep going back and changing the size of these outlets. And then there's all of this court case and litigation over it. So, this whole infrastructure solves problems, but creates other ones. Yeah, so I think that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. And that's how I was thinking about the last point that you made, how one generation's solutions are the next generation's problems. Yeah, I mean, this whole infrastructure project in Punjab, in a number like political ways and in environmental ways, is a disaster. As we know that most of these very large water development projects are, as we've learned now, there's problems with Labib also pointed out, waterlogging and salinity, which renders a lot of the land just incultivable. But there's also lasting impacts, like the water is distributed between what becomes India and Pakistan through this infrastructure system. So the Indus Water Treaty of '65. This is sort of the pre-history of that. Yeah, I mean, we face the same problems. They come back in a different guise. I spend a lot of time in Shigar, where I'm working with the local community on some flood embankment projects, and a lot of there's large-scale infrastructure development again in North Pakistan because of the CPEC, so the China Road and Belt Initiative. And they've literally, I mean, it's ridiculous that these are the largest some of the largest mountains in the world, and they have just erased them. They have slowly and surely to build dams for water and power. So it's the same story again and again, and here we are.
Just upsetting the core question that, abundance is always natural wealth, but it's just an assumption, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a couple of questions on the chat. First from Sarah. Sarah, would you like to read a question or say your question? Thanks.
Yeah,
then-
thank you, Labib. I think this is a question for you. It was a fascinating talk, and to be honest, new for me to hear about the, the dumping of waste that then becomes the base for construction. And I was just wondering, did the colonial government strategically place these dumping grounds in places where they thought, okay, maybe here we want to, because at first hand it sounds contradictory, right? Like you'll dump your waste as far away as possible and not in a prominent place, but then you see these buildings coming up on these lands. So that's one. And the second part to the question is, you mentioned that the elite kind of joined the colonial view on, we have to sanitize this place, but who was resisting this? And I think that ties into Ishita's question, like who was living there, and is there a voice?
Yeah,
Right,
great
of
question. Yeah, thank you so much. These are really great questions. And talking about, first of all, the trenching system, I think it was William Gregg and then A.E. Silk, who were the sanitary engineers, and they actually kind of imported the idea that was, I think, first implemented in some European towns. So the main idea was like dumping the waste, and that ground will be then utilized as for cultivation, for farming, and which would eventually kind of prepare the ground in a much more faster pace. But then there were these different prejudices and customs. I mean, the locals did not follow the cultivation part. So it was like a half imported ideas, like the waste were dumped, but then the cultivation, even though they were like in every sanitary report, Silk was saying that the instructions were not being implemented. But yeah, I mean, in most cases, they did not do the cultivation in those lands. But then it was this idea of like definitely the older part of the city, which was very congested. And initially, like we have seen, like in other colonial towns, there were this segregation of colonial. I mean, the colonizers and the people who were colonized. I mean, there were these segregations in town planning and zoning. But in case of Dhaka, there were no such segregation in the first place. I mean, they utilized some of the buildings within the older Dhaka part as their administrative buildings, but they actually envisioned the northern open area for which is kind of far from the congestion and uncertainties and like all the debates, kind of protests going on. So those were seen as a potential place for future urban expansion. And so and also, I mean, talking about the resistances, initially we have seen like I talked about the bond project in the first chapter of my dissertation, and it was very much resisted by the local people because it kind of created a barrier between their their dwelling areas and the riverside areas where they went for bathing, washing, and many other daily purpose. So the road kind of worked as a barrier. They vehemently resisted initially, but the same people, like within like 10, 15 years, after 10, 15 years, they could mobilize those hygiene discourse and mobilize the number of deaths being reduced, the cholera deaths, and these same people would eventually kind of, honored the commissioner Buckland, who was actually conceived that bond project. And I mean, in the case of Ramna area, there were this protest for saving those religious structures. I talked about the temple, but eventually the Hindus were minority in terms of like after 1905, since it was the Muslim majority voice, which were like very important for the colonizers. They could eventually get the control of the land for the temple, but for those majars, those Muslim the tombs for different Muslim historical figures, they could not touch it. And there was like really powerful resistance on that end. So they had to keep those structures. But as I say, like they could successfully mobilize the hygiene discourse, which is why like the elite also participated in filling up the low-lying areas. Yeah.
Thank you. We've also got a question from Ishita. Ishita, would you like to read out your question also?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting conversation. I think I'll just keep it short. I think for both the projects, I was very curious if there was a way to engage with what happened to the indigenous communities in those sites of investigation. I can imagine if they are not around, maybe one would have to speak with their descendants. And was there displacement? I'm also thinking, was it displacement? Was it migration? And how would that inform the study of the drawings and the images? I was thinking of it when I was listening to Javairia, but I think it's also equally relevant to Labib's work.
Thank you for that question, and it's a brilliant question because it's made me think about my work in a whole other way. So it's not so much in most of the canal colonies, especially the Chenab, it's not so much that indigenous communities are displaced as much as they are emplaced. So this is barren desert at the what the British think of as barren desert at the time. But it really isn't. There's no magic pastoral communities that pass through this region. There's tribes that come from, the Wakhan corridor downwards, and also, regionally, like from Thar, etc. So there's a number of communities that pass through this area throughout the year. And that's threatening to the British. Things that move around generally are. And so this is, I think I had a slide on that, but never got around to chatting about it. They do this whole tribal taxonomy project. And so, they're like, okay, for Punjab, there are these different kinds of castes. There are agricultural castes, there are non-agricultural castes. And then, there's various kinds. And then, there's what is titled criminal castes. So anybody who moves around is labeled like either a thuggy or a dacoit. And then these criminal castes are then settled. In a number of cases that I found, I don't know, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but in a number of cases, I have found that they're settled close to where canal construction work is about to start. So, these are the people who are then employed to do all of the dirty work. They're the ones who are, then they're the ones who go not only construct, but also, are settled in these settlements to work on the maintenance of these canals, because these canals fill up with silt. They have to be maintained every year. So there's that aspect of it. And then I gave a talk a little while ago, and the respondent, Sonali Dhanpal, called me out on this, and it's something that I need to work on more. So, there's a bifurcation between what is agricultural castes and non-agricultural castes. This is also the time that, Punjab provides, I think, 45% of all of the recruits for the British Army in this time period. So, there's martial castes, there's agricultural castes. What the Land Alienation Act of, I think it's 1901, what it does is that it says that legally only agricultural castes are allowed to own land, and non-agricultural castes are not allowed to own land in like these particular regions. But it's not so much, it's, the people who own land as opposed to people who work on the land are completely different sets of people, right? And so there's a number of, different, I guess, tribes who are tenant farmers, right? Who kind of, the idea is that they will perform this labor and then, build up enough resources to buy land and become landed. But what the land of the act does is that it says, they can't own land. And this includes people like the Chamars and other Dalit groups. And that's, this is, where I'm putting the history together. I'm currently looking through missionary records, because one of the things that the church does is says that, well, if you convert, then through this, procedure, you will be able to own land. So it's setting up all of these, the transformation of how water is thought about and legally enforced and measured and taxed, creates all of these different processes through which social hierarchies are being, layered in different ways. And so suddenly, for example, the Jat farmers in Punjab become very powerful. But that means that they are powerful over, tenant workers like the chamars, etc. So it's a re-entrenchment of certain caste categories. Sorry, that was a long answer to what you asked. I hope I answered at least some of your queries.
Thanks, Javairia. Labib, I know that you have a teaching commitment. You have to leave us in a couple of minutes. We've got one quick question from Yakin, which I wondered whether you would have time to very briefly answer. Yakin, you also have a class starting up. Are you still here?
Yeah.
Would you like to ask the question?
Okay, I'll just go for it in a minute. Thanks for both the presentations. Labib, my question was, since you're looking at the urban transformations in Dhaka, did you also come across the idea of wetness being dealt with in the colonial period in rural Bengal? And if there were different kinds of approaches, if so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yakin. I mean, answering both Ishita and Yakin. Ishita, good to see you, and thanks for the question. So, yeah, I mean, if, for example, I mean, in my case, I'm looking at the late 19th, early 20th century, and for that time period, it's really, it's a challenge. I mean, it's a same thing for, I think, not just for Dhaka. I mean, for overall South Asia, it's a challenge to find the indigenous sources, which is really very important and relevant. But at the same time, I really found some very interesting interesting information from the colonial archives that kind of give us clues. For example, one of the drawings in one of the report by a sanitary engineer, I found a term named ghor, and this is referring to an indigenous water network system that was maybe implemented during the Mughal times, because I found ghor is a Persian term, but then again now in Bangla we use the term as like a dwelling. So it's a very, but how this term was used for denoting water bodies is a very interesting question. But then I asked several people. In some cases, I have found that some local people saying that it means the dumping, dumping pond, disposing waste in a pond. So you can maybe sense that there was this sort of kind of a discursive transformation happened, and it changed the meaning as well. But if you look at some of the maps that I showed, the proposed trenching ground maps, you will see that there were not just like these water bodies and like indigenous water networks, but also the settlements. People were living there, right? But the way the trenching ground was applied, it flattening the landscape and pushing those people again and again to the more periphery of the city. So you have these clues there, the fragments, the existence of their existence in those drawings, but then how to kind of recuperate the voices from those fragments is a kind of an interesting part of the research. And talking about answering Yakin's question, I mean, in talking about the wetness, I think in my in my master research, I talked about the muslin weavers, and these muslin weavers were kind of at some point they were based on Dhaka. And this muslin is a kind of a cotton fabric which was renowned for its very delicacy and thinness. But this weaving practice was very much dependent on the existence of moisture in the atmosphere. So you can see that's a another alternative understanding of water. And this weaving practice kind of really challenges the dichotomy, like rural, urban, or inside, outside, exterior, interior. I mean, the dichotomies that are historically constructed. And so this is a very good example of wetness. And unfortunately, the muslin, the plant that was used for the cotton, which got extinct, and the practice is no more, but there are still like weaving practice in different forms in the other areas. So there are some existing local practices. Pul bandi is one of them, which is not which is a kind of a embankment system, indigenous embankment system, not like with permanent materials or permanent structures, but very much using temporary materials for a temporary time period. I think Robert Travers is working on them. So you'll find a lot of local practices that kind of directs to these alternative understandings. I guess I will stop here, but thanks for the questions.
Thank you so much. I wish that we had, I think we'll extend this conversation in the next session on landscape ecology and environment. I was struck just very briefly by the idea that hygiene and the management of cyclical abundance continue to be major narratives in contemporary development projects, including the redevelopment of India's rivers, for example, and mechanisms by which these projects function. I think, Labib, you've also partially answered a question that I wanted to ask, because we've talked extensively, you don't have to answer, I'll just sort of state it and leave it out there, but we've talked extensively about the major transformations that humans are making on the landscape, and really unimaginable transformations, which we got a glimpse of in these presentations. I'm also quite interested in the kind of agency of nature itself to affect the form of those developments. And I think, Labib, when you've mentioned the idea that certain types of muslin can only be woven in humid environments, that's suggesting that nature itself is determining human practice. The fact that these sites of reclamation were happening where there were already villages suggests that people have already occupied the places where nature is less kind of intense. So I guess for both of you, I was interested in whether there were kind of any indications that nature was forming the path or direction of any of the sort of infrastructural projects that we've seen. And I know that a lot of people do need to go. So there is one more question from Sarah for Javairia, which is also a very interesting question. If you have time still to answer it and people have time to stay, that would be great. But I'd like to thank you so much, Labib, for joining us and for the fantastic presentation. And also to you, Javairia, if you can stay, I'll thank you at the end. But thank you so much. It was really, both of these presentations and the response and the discussion have been fascinating. And I hope that we'll be able to pick up some of these themes in the next landscape ecology and environment session.
Thank you so much. Bye.
I have a quick announcement for those who are still there. Our next PATIO conversation will happen on 10th of April. And we have 8 research teams in our conversations. And as Catherine said, we've just completed the first cycle with this conversation of the first 8 teams. So we are restarting with the subject of tools of building practice. And we are a little bit experimenting with the format. We will, instead of having 10-15-minute presentations, in our next conversation, we have asked speakers to bring drawings from their research. And each speaker, including Saptarshi and I, who are the team directors, will present 3-4 drawings. And we will focus on the role of the drawing as a tool of building practice. And our idea is to really scrutinize them very closely and analyze how their annotations and their details reveal how drawings may have different roles in the making process, and how the very nature of the drawing reflects a particular design and building process that might deviate from what is usually considered the architectural standard. So we are delighted to have Swati Chattopadhyay join us, as well as Megha Chand Inglis. My apologies for the pronunciation, but we have these 2 distinguished speakers who will bring some drawings from their recent research. So look forward to see you on 10th of April.